Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera, where today's video is going to be about what is the most unusual Yashica Electro 35 camera made, and that happens to be this camera right here. This should be good for a thumbnail image, I think. So, this camera, for those of you who are familiar with Yashicas, you look at it and you'll say, wow, it's a Yashica Electro 35 CCN camera. There's nothing so unusual about that. Now, they're not super common, but you see them in a lot of places, and they're not that hard to find on eBay and places like that. But this one is a little bit different from the usual Yashica CCN camera, in that it's actually a Yashica Electro 35 CC. This is one of these kind of odd things which occasionally gets put out of camera factories in Japan, kind of like a coin which is mistakenly put out by a mint. They accidentally put two heads on the front, on the front and back of a coin, and sometimes camera manufacturers mistakenly release cameras like this on the market. When I got this camera the other day, I was I saw it and I wasn't so much surprised by it, because I thought, well, what happened is someone bought a CCN camera and then they dropped it or had to have it fixed for warranty reasons, and Yashica just put a new top on it. But when I took apart the camera to check it out, I found out that this is the original cover on the top, and somehow it just got put on this thing. The soldering was original, and also the spacer and stuff used for the film rewind lever was original. And you can you can spot a CCN camera besides the emblems for a few other things. The first is that when you hold the camera like that, this lever always falls down. It's something which is really annoying to some people, and I've sold a lot of these cameras, and from time to time people will come back and say, well, there's a problem with the camera. The winding lever just keeps popping open, and it shouldn't do that. But unfortunately, that's kind of something that Yashica overlooked in the design. It's supposed to be that way, or maybe it wasn't intentionally supposed to be that way, but that's the way it is. I've come across two of these cameras which were still brand new in the box, and they do the same thing. It's not really an issue in 99% of shooting. It's not going to bother you. The only time it becomes a problem is you're like trying to take pictures of your kneecap or something like that, which I never do on purpose, but which I often do accidentally. That's the only time you're really going to be bothered by this. Otherwise, just leave it alone. Or if it bothers you too much, you just tape it into place. It's not a big deal. Yeah, really unusual that this is a kind of one of these escapees from the Yashica factory. I say this is kind of an expert on Yashica cameras. When I first started selling cameras from Japan more than a decade ago, I specialized in Yashicas, and over the years I've sold maybe somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 of these guys, so I guess I'm pretty well qualified as an expert in these cameras. And this is the only one which, like this, the CC version of the CCN wide, which I've seen in real life. But it's not the only odd variation. I've seen one more of these cameras, not exactly like this, but very similar. And the other one which I saw was the very first Yashica camera which I bought when I came to Japan, and I happen to have that one right here. And this one has the opposite feature. This has everything that looks like a CC, except that the top says CCN. And you can tell I've used this camera quite a lot. It's been pretty well beat to hell. I bought this in a flea market here in Japan for, I think it was like $10 when I first came here. It was sitting on a blanket with a bunch of other junk in a park across the street. So I went over and I thought, it looks pretty cool. So how much you want? 10 yen. So I bought it, and it didn't work. So I cleaned out the battery contacts in the battery chamber, and it started working. So then I decided, well, the light seals are bad, and it's got fungus on the inside of the lens, so I should go ahead and fix it. So I bought some basic tools at the Tokyo Hand store. This was the first Yashica camera which I ever, turned a wrench on in Japan. Little knowing at the time that this would be kind of like the camera which motivated me into getting into the camera selling business, which is what I do pretty much full time nowadays. I kind of learned to repair cameras, starting with this camera here, because as you can tell, from time to time, a camera used this much is going to need a little bit of work. And what I learned by working on this camera translated pretty easily over to a lot of other cameras. And as time went on, I began to learn about how to fix the other ones as well. So I wasn't entirely mechanically inept. I had some experience. When I was a student, I worked as a jeweler. I used to manufacture jewelry, rings, bracelets, pendants, things like that. And I got pretty good with using precision tools and doing fine work. So it wasn't so difficult to get into taking these things. If a person could put something together, someone else can take it apart and put it back together. So this was the first one. I didn't know there was anything special about this camera until I started trading them. And I said, well, this one doesn't have the wide thing on the bottom, so it's just kind of like a hobbled together a CC in with this, a CC with a CC in top. And then when I looked on the inside, I found that this has CC in internals. And there are differences between the CC and CC in camera other than the name and the emblem on the front. Yashica brought out the Electro 35 series in the mid-1960s, and they were quite a hit. They were extremely well-made cameras. There was kind of a desire for quality cameras in those days, which could take good photographs, and technology was progressing quickly, and the transistor had just been invented and was being put into just about everything in those days. And if it had a sign or something on it that said transistorized, like a radio or something like that, that gave its appeal to the market. So Yashica invented the Electro 35 camera with an electronically controlled shutter using transistors, which Yashica called a computer brain. So but computers were very primitive back in those days, and that wasn't really a big stretch or a huge euphemism to say that a series of transistors and resistors were a computer. When nowadays I think we have, for example, in a processor, a graphics processor, maybe 1 million transistors put into a single processor, where I think the Yashica had 3 or 4 transistors. But it worked, and it worked incredibly well. And the quality of the images these cameras put out made them very popular. They were superb cameras, a very good value at the time, and very easy for people to use. And over the years, Yashica improved these cameras, and then in the later years, they introduced the CC, which was a compact camera, a very small version of the Electro 35 CC with and one of the attractions of the Electro 35 series was that it had a fast lens, which allowed it to shoot with the slower film speeds available at the time. So Yashica decided that their compact camera should also have a fast lens, but also they decided to make a wide-angle lens. This turned out to be a big engineering adventure for Yashica, because a 35mm f1.8 lens, it doesn't sound like a really difficult or complicated thing to make, and that's what Yashica at first thought, but then they found out otherwise. Problem with these lenses is the fast lenses that they suffer from a thing called chromatic aberration, which means they can't easily focus all the colors on the same plane, and you can get color fringing on your images. So Yashica solved this problem the way other makers did, by using a different kind of glass. They used what were called rare earths, which rare earths are kind of what's it called, thorium, which is a mildly radioactive element, which when added to the glass makes it more capable of focusing color or directing color more accurately than other types of glass. And later on, this was replaced by a fluorite glass, and later years by Canon and Nikon and such. So when they got the formula ready for the glass, they had to introduce a new kind of shutter for this camera. This was because the wide aperture lens requires somewhat of a larger shutter, but they couldn't really use the shutter off the full-size Electro 35 cameras because it was too large and complicated. And if you've ever taken like the front rings off of this and looked inside, you see a series of resistors and contacts and slider switches and all this kind of stuff. It's really complex and too big to fit on a small camera like this. So Yashica migrated the electronics to different parts of the camera to make the lens design more compact and make it look like a well-proportioned and well-balanced camera, which it is. But they had to do a couple of things to accomplish this. And the first thing they did was have to modify the aperture system. So the apertures in most cameras, fixed lens rangefinder cameras, use 5 blades. Certain ones use 7 blades. There are different kinds of blade designs used over the years, but generally 90% of them use a 5-bladed aperture. Yashica couldn't fit a 5-bladed aperture in this camera, so they came up with a simple 2-bladed aperture. And I don't know if you'll be able to see this with my really cheesy Canon camera, which I'm using to record this video, but this camera uses 2 different aperture blades with a kind of unusual shape. And when you stop it down a little bit, it looks kind of like a goat unicorn. That's the shape of a goat's face with 2 ears and a horn sticking up in the top. Or maybe it looks a little bit like that spinning top they used from the movie Inception when you look at it from the side. And it looks like that when it's kind of open, and as you stop it down, it starts to look something like, I don't know, Batman flying in the air or something. And it's kind of an odd shape, and it's a little bit like an anamorphic lens, which they use in cinematography. Not at all like the aperture system used in most cameras. So that is a really cool thing about this camera, and you can see it in the highlights. Like when you watch movies shot with different kind of lenses, you can see the effective spherical lenses. They have that kind of like the circles in the back, which kind of sometimes have straight edges on them, 5 edges or 7 edges depending on the lens. And then there are the anamorphic lenses, which have irises, which are kind of like what you see in a reptile or a cat. And the highlights have that shape. And then you have this camera here, which has that kind of system. It's not really an anamorphic lens, but the aperture system gives it something of an anamorphic effect. And so for those of you who are like really serious into cinematography or unusual lenses for cameras, this one would probably be really appealing for you. So that's the second thing which they had to overcome to make this camera. The last thing was the shutter itself. Now, the full-size Electro 35 cameras had speeds of up to 1/500th of a second, depending on the year and such. There's a little variation in that. But because of the size of the shutter and the weight of the shutter blades, they had to use a maximum speed of 1/250th of a second. And also a simpler 2-blade shutter design compared to the 5-blade shutter or different shutters. Yeah, I'm just trying to think. Different designs of shutters in there, but this one has fewer blades than the other Electro 35 series cameras. The fewer the blades there are, the less inertia there is, and the less tension is necessary to make them move. So kind of an unusual amount of work which was necessary to get this camera manufactured. And it turned out to be a really good camera. So the CC and CCN, the CCN was the new version of the Electro 35 CC. The CCN featured a much more improved electronics. They were much more reliable than the other Electro 35 cameras, and probably the most reliable of any Electro 35 camera. The CC featured a problem with the POD, or pad of death, which was softer in, like the earlier Yashica Electros. They could degrade or flake or fall apart over time, which would cause inaccuracy in the shutter. The CCN improved the material, so it's seldom a problem. And also, the CC featured a long maximum shutter speed of like up to 60 seconds or something like that, kind of like the full-size Electro 35 cameras. But it was inconsistent, and it was hard to get the camera to fire at that. It doesn't have to be really consistent at long speed, because accurate is usually, you know, if it's within half a stop or so, it's accurate enough for color negative film. And when you're shooting at high speed, you don't really notice half a stop. It's unnoticeable. At slow speeds, it becomes more noticeable. The difference between 1 second and 2 seconds is really noticeable, but if it's supposed to be 1 second and it's firing at 2 seconds, believe it or not, that's still good enough for negative film. You know, that's still just one stop of speed. But in order to kind of improve the accuracy of the slow speed shutter, it was redesigned, and you have only, I guess, a maximum of a 30-second shutter speed in the CCN compared to the 1 minute which you had in the CC. And the odd thing about these cameras is this one is basically looks like a CC on the outside with the CC in top cover, but it has the CC in internals with the long shutter speed and the improved POD. This one says CC on the outside, but also has the improved CC and stuff on the inside. So really cool cameras. But anyway, this video is kind of running on pretty long, and my battery's getting a little bit low, and I don't want to be cut off in the middle of the video. So I plan to be selling this camera shortly, so any of you who are interested in a really interesting Yashica camera, pretty much a one-of-a-kind, please check out my stores. I hope to have this thing listed tonight or tomorrow. I also have a couple of CCNs or other ones, the normal CCNs, which I'll have available. So anyone who's interested in this anamorphic aperture kind of rangefinder camera, please come back and take a look, and maybe you'll be interested in those. I've got a lot of more things I'll be listing later on this weekend, a lot more TLR and other type of cameras, so please check my stores if you're interested in those. I plan to be doing videos as regularly as possible. YouTube has been encouraging me lately to try to post more videos, and so I'm going to go ahead and do as they ask and go along and try to produce them. So if you'd like to see these, please subscribe. If you like this video, likes are always appreciated. Please click the like button. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.